The city had once been a place of life and laughter, but the war had drained it of color and sound. The streets were now lined with the hollow shells of buildings, their windows shattered and walls scarred by the relentless bombardment. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and the omnipresent dust that settled on everything, choking the breath of anyone who dared to inhale too deeply. The distant echoes of gunfire were a constant reminder of the battle that raged beyond the city's borders, a battle that had transformed this once thriving place into a ghost town. Clara moved swiftly through the makeshift hospital, her footsteps soft but hurried, a small echo in the near-empty corridors. The hospital had been a school, and the remnants of its previous life clung stubbornly to the walls' chalkboards now covered in medical notes, broken desks pushed into corners, and lockers that still held forgotten textbooks. The few remaining patients lay on cots that had been crammed into the classrooms, their faces pale and eyes hollow. The war had stripped the city of its vibrancy, leaving behind only shadows and echoes. Yet Clara, despite the overwhelming darkness, clung to her duty like a lifeline. As she tended to an elderly man with a deep gash on his arm, Clara's thoughts drifted to her family, who had fled weeks ago. The choice to stay had not been easy, but it had been necessary. The hospital was desperately understaffed, supplies were dwindling, and the people left behind were the ones who had nowhere else to go. Clara knew that her presence made a difference, even if only in the smallest ways. She kept moving, kept caring, because it was all she could do in a world that seemed to be falling apart at the seams. The constant rumble of distant explosions served as a reminder that the war was never far away. The city had been spared complete devastation, but it was a fragile reprieve, one that could be shattered at any moment. Every day, Clara wondered if the next bomb would fall closer, if the hospital would be the next target. But there was no time to dwell on such thoughts. As long as there were people who needed her, Clara would stay. She was determined to hold on to the small, fragile pieces of hope that still existed, even in the midst of chaos. The day had begun with the usual tension, the hospital buzzing with subdued activity as Clara and the few remaining staff tended to the wounded. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken fears, every sound outside sending a ripple of anxiety through the building. Clara had just finished cleaning a young boy's wound when a sudden commotion near the entrance made her freeze. Her heart skipped a beat as she instinctively turned toward the source, expecting another wave of injured civilians, or worse, soldiers demanding aid. What she saw instead was beyond anything she could have anticipated. A wild wolf, its fur matted and its eyes wide with fear, had somehow found its way into the hospital. It moved with frantic energy, its paws slipping on the slick floor as it darted down the corridor. The staff, already on edge, scattered in panic, their shouts echoing through the halls as they sought refuge from the unexpected intruder. Clara's mind raced. A wolf here in the heart of the city, in the midst of war. It seemed impossible, yet there it was, a creature out of place in a world already turned upside down. Clara's first instinct was to run, to follow the others and find safety. But something stopped her. The wolf wasn't acting aggressively. If anything, it seemed as frightened as the people around it. And then she noticed what it was carrying in its mouth, a small, delicate bundle of fur and feathers, cradled gently between its powerful jaws. Clara squinted, trying to make out what it was. A young animal, but not a wolf cub. Something different, something that didn't belong here any more than the wolf did. Her curiosity was piqued, but more than that, she felt a tug of empathy for both the wolf and the fragile creature it was protecting. Taking a deep breath, Clara knew she had to act. The hospital wasn't safe for a wild animal, especially one as out of place as this wolf. But she couldn't drive it away, not when it was carrying something so precious. Gathering her courage, she began to move slowly toward the wolf, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Easy, easy," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. The wolf's eyes locked onto hers, and for a brief moment, the noise of the war outside faded into the background. It was just Clara and the wolf, two beings caught in the chaos, both searching for something to hold on to. Clara's heart pounded as she took another cautious step toward the wolf. Its eyes, wide and filled with a strange mix of fear and determination, never left hers. The bundle in its mouth stirred slightly, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. Whatever it was alive. She had to get closer, had to see what the wolf was carrying. As she inched forward, the wolf shifted, but it didn't flee. Clara could now see more clearly the bundle was a small, fragile creature, unlike anything she had ever seen. It was a delicate mix of fur and feathers, with wide, frightened eyes that reflected the chaos around it. Kneeling slowly to make herself less threatening, Clara extended her hand cautiously, her fingers trembling slightly. The wolf's ears twitched, but it remained still, watching her every move. Clara reached out a bit further, her hand almost close enough to touch the creature. The wolf, seemingly assessing her intentions, took a cautious step closer. Clara could now see the creature's tiny, trembling body, so small and vulnerable, so out of place in this ravaged world. It looked up at her with wide eyes, as if sensing that she was its only hope. The realization hit Clara with force. This creature was extraordinary, something that needed to be protected at all costs. And the wolf, a wild animal, had taken on that role, even in the midst of war. The war had brought so much destruction, but here was a small piece of life that had somehow survived. Clara felt a surge of determination. She couldn't let anything happen to the wolf or the creature it protected. They had found their way to her, and she was now responsible for them. No matter the danger, no matter the cost, she would keep them safe. Gently, Clara extended her hand further, reaching out to the creature. The wolf hesitated for a moment, then slowly lowered its head, placing the tiny animal into Clara's waiting palm. The creature was warm, its small body trembling with fear and exhaustion. Clara could feel its rapid heartbeat against her skin. The wolf stepped back slightly, its eyes still locked on hers, as if searching for reassurance. "It's okay," Clara whispered, cradling the creature close to her chest. "I'll take care of it." The wolf watched her for a moment longer, then seemed to relax, as if relieved. Clara knew she had made a promise not just to the wolf, but to herself. She would protect them no matter what. The fragile peace inside the hospital was shattered by the sudden, deafening sound of an explosion nearby. The walls trembled, and dust fell from the ceiling as the ground shook beneath Clara's feet. The war was closing in, and it was clear that the hospital was no longer safe. Shouts erupted from the staff as they rushed to gather supplies and prepare the patients for evacuation. Clara held the small creature tightly against her chest, her mind racing. She couldn't leave it behind, but how could she ensure its safety in the chaos that was about to unfold? Clara quickly assessed her options. The hospital's designated evacuation point was in the basement, a reinforced area that could withstand some of the bombardment. But the basement was also crowded with people, patients, staff, and the few civilians who had sought refuge here. Bringing a wild wolf down there, even with the creature it was protecting, would cause panic. Clara glanced at the wolf, which stood by her side, its eyes filled with a mixture of trust and fear. She had to make a decision, and she had to make it fast. As Clara weighed her choices, the hospital's head nurse, Maria, approached her. "Clara, we have to go," she urged, her voice tense. Maria's eyes widened when she saw the wolf. "What in God's name?" Clara quickly explained the situation, though her words felt rushed and inadequate. Maria stared at the wolf and the small creature in Clara's arms, her expression a mix of disbelief and concern. "You can't take them with us," Maria insisted. "It's too dangerous. We have to think about everyone's safety." Clara's heart sank, but she knew Maria was right. The evacuation would be chaotic, and any disruption could put lives at risk. But as Clara looked down at the trembling creature in her arms, she felt a surge of protectiveness. She couldn't just abandon them. "I'll find another way," Clara said firmly. "I'll keep them safe." Maria hesitated, then nodded, her face softening with understanding. "Be careful," she whispered before turning to help with the evacuation. Clara watched her go, then turned back to the wolf, which was still waiting patiently. "Come on," Clara murmured. "We'll find a safe place." "I promise." Clara moved quickly through the hospital, the small creature nestled securely in her arms, and the wolf padding silently beside her. She needed to find a place where they could wait out the chaos without drawing attention. The upper floors of the hospital had been mostly abandoned, deemed too dangerous due to the risk of collapse, but Clara knew there were still a few rooms that might offer refuge. As she climbed the stairs, the sounds of the evacuation faded behind her, leaving only the soft echoes of her footsteps and the distant rumble of the war outside. Reaching the third floor, Clara found a small, windowless room that had once been an office. The door was still intact, and the room appeared sturdy enough. She gently set the creature down on a table and turned to the wolf, who was watching her with an intensity that made her heart ache. "We'll be safe here, at least for a little while," Clara said, more to reassure herself than the wolf. She couldn't help but marvel at the bond that had formed between them. In the midst of war, with fear and uncertainty all around, they had found trust in each other. The wolf moved closer to the table, sniffing at the creature, which had calmed down but still looked fragile and scared. Clara watched them, her mind racing with questions. What was this creature? How had it come to be here, in this war-torn city? And why had the wolf, a wild animal, taken it upon itself to protect it? The situation was surreal, but Clara had no time to dwell on the mystery. She needed to focus on keeping them all safe, at least until the danger passed. As Clara sat down on the floor, exhaustion finally catching up with her, the wolf lay down beside her, resting its head on its paws. There was a strange comfort in the wolf's presence, a sense that despite everything, they would find a way through this. Clara reached out and gently stroked the wolf's fur, feeling the tension slowly leave her body. "We'll get through this together," she whispered. The wolf's eyes met hers, and for a moment, the war outside seemed distant, almost forgotten. In that small room, amidst the ruins of the city, they had found a moment of peace. The peace they had found in the small room was short-lived. Clara knew that staying in the hospital was not a long-term solution. The bombings were getting closer, and the building, already weakened by the war, could collapse at any moment. She had to think of a plan, something that would get them out safely. As she sat there, the small creature still resting on the table and the wolf lying quietly beside her, Clara's mind raced through the possibilities. She knew the city well, but the war had turned familiar streets into dangerous territory. Clara decided their best chance was to reach the underground shelter she had heard about, a place where a few families and remaining civilians had taken refuge. It wasn't far, just a few blocks away, but getting there would be risky. The streets were likely patrolled by soldiers, and the sound of gunfire had been constant. She couldn't risk being caught out in the open. But staying here was not an option either. Clara looked at the wolf, who had been watching her intently, as if sensing her thoughts. "We need to move," she said softly, determination setting in. Clara gathered a few supplies from the room, an old blanket she could use to wrap the creature, a flashlight, and a small medical kit. She carefully wrapped the creature, making sure it was secure but comfortable, and then turned to the wolf. "I need you to stay close," she whispered, knowing the wolf understood far more than she could ever imagine. The wolf rose to its feet, ready to follow her lead. Clara took a deep breath, opened the door, and peeked out into the hallway. The hospital was eerily quiet now. Most of the staff and patients evacuated. It was time to go. With the creature bundled in her arms and the wolf at her side, Clara moved through the hospital's deserted corridors. Each step was cautious, every sound amplified by the silence that surrounded them. The fear that had been gnawing at her since the war began was now a constant presence, but Clara pushed it aside. There was no room for hesitation. As they approached the exit, Clara paused, listening for any signs of danger. The streets outside were shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from the occasional flash of distant explosions. It was now or never. Clara tightened her grip on the creature and stepped outside, the wolf following closely behind. The night air was heavy with smoke and the acrid smell of burning buildings. Clara stepped cautiously onto the rubble-strewn street, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of danger. The city that had once been her home was now an unfamiliar landscape, twisted and broken by the relentless assault of war. The wolf stayed close to her side, its eyes sharp and alert, ready to react to any threat. They moved quickly, Clara's heart pounding in her chest as she navigated the shattered remains of the city. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow a potential threat. As they approached the underground shelter, a loud, rumbling noise echoed through the streets. Clara froze, instinctively tightening her hold on the creature in her arms. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, and she realized with horror that the source of the noise was the hospital behind them. She turned just in time to see the building shudder violently, its weakened structure finally giving way. The hospital, which had stood as a beacon of hope amidst the destruction, began to collapse in on itself, sending a cloud of dust and debris billowing into the air. Clara's first instinct was to run, but the wolf stopped her, standing its ground as if trying to protect her from the falling debris. The collapse was rapid, the building crumbling in a matter of seconds. The noise was deafening, and Clara felt the ground shake beneath her as the hospital was reduced to a pile of rubble. For a moment, all she could do was stand there, paralyzed by the sight of the place where she had spent so many days caring for the wounded and dying. The loss hit her like a physical blow, but there was no time to grieve. As the dust began to settle, Clara forced herself to move, her legs shaky but determined. She couldn't afford to linger. The collapse of the hospital had likely drawn attention, and they were now even more vulnerable than before. The wolf nudged her gently, urging her to continue. Clara nodded, taking a deep breath to steady herself. They had to keep moving, had to reach the shelter before it was too late. The path ahead was uncertain, but Clara knew she had no choice but to press on. With the creature safely cradled in her arms and the wolf by her side, she turned and headed toward the only hope they had left. The street ahead was dark and eerily silent, the distant sounds of war momentarily drowned out by the ringing in Clara's ears. She moved quickly, the adrenaline coursing through her veins as she pushed forward, guided only by the faint memories of the city she once knew. The wolf trotted beside her, its presence a steadying force in the chaos. As they neared the shelter, Clara's heart lifted slightly. Just a few more steps, and they would be safe, at least for the moment. But as they rounded the final corner, her hope was shattered by the sight before her. The entrance to the shelter was blocked by a massive pile of debris. The recent bombardment had caused part of the building above to collapse, sealing off the underground refuge. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the blocked doorway, her mind racing. She was so close, but now it seemed their only chance of safety was gone. The creature in her arms stirred, and the wolf whined softly, as if sensing the growing despair. Clara felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her, but she couldn't afford to give up. Not now. Desperation fueled her actions as Clara searched for another way in. She scanned the surrounding area, looking for any cracks or gaps in the debris that might allow them entry. The wolf, seemingly understanding her intent, began to dig at the rubble with its powerful paws. Clara joined in, using her hands to pull away loose stones and broken wood. Every second felt like an eternity, the threat of discovery looming over them. But Clara refused to stop. She had to find a way to protect the creature and herself, no matter what it took. After what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, the wolf's efforts revealed a small opening, just big enough for them to squeeze through. Clara peered into the dark space beyond, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. It wasn't much, but it was a chance. She quickly bundled the creature more securely in the blanket, then gestured for the wolf to go first. The wolf hesitated, its eyes meeting hers with an unspoken question, but Clara nodded firmly. "Go," she whispered. The wolf slipped through the opening, and Clara followed, her body trembling as she crawled into the darkness, praying that they had finally found safety. The shelter was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of earth and dust. Clara crouched low as she entered, her heart still racing from the close call outside. The wolf was already inside, pacing nervously in the confined space. Clara quickly assessed their surroundings. The room was small, with rough stone walls and a dirt floor, but it was sturdy. It had likely been used as a storage cellar before the war, repurposed now as a makeshift refuge. It wasn't ideal, but it was safe. At least for the moment, they were out of immediate danger. Clara gently unwrapped the creature. Setting it down on a blanket, she spread across the floor. It looked up at her with wide, frightened eyes, its tiny body still trembling. The creature was weak, but Clara could see that it had a strong will to survive. She reached for the small medical kit she had brought, carefully administering what little aid she could. The wolf watched her closely, its eyes filled with a mixture of concern and trust. Clara could feel the bond between them growing stronger with each passing moment. In this dark, forgotten place, they had found a sense of purpose in protecting each other. As Clara worked, she couldn't help but think about the journey that had brought them here. The city was being torn apart by the war, and they were just three small beings trying to survive in the midst of it all. But despite the destruction and fear, they had found each other. Clara knew that this connection was something rare, something that the war could not take away from them. She felt a renewed sense of determination. They had made it this far, and she would do everything in her power to ensure they made it through the night. The hours passed slowly in the shelter, the sound of distant explosions a constant reminder of the world outside. Clara sat with her back against the wall, the wolf lying close beside her, its head resting on her lap. The creature had finally fallen asleep, its small body curled up on the blanket. Clara felt exhaustion pulling at her, but she forced herself to stay awake, her thoughts drifting between the past and the uncertain future. As she stroked the wolf's fur, Clara whispered softly, "We're going to make it through this. All of us." The wolf's eyes flickered open briefly, then closed again, its breathing steady and calm. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Clara allowed herself to believe that they might just survive. The first light of dawn began to filter through the cracks in the shelter's ceiling, casting a faint glow over the cramped space. Clara blinked awake, her body stiff from the night spent on the cold, hard floor. The wolf was already up, standing guard near the entrance, its ears perked and alert. The small creature was still asleep, its tiny chest rising and falling steadily. Clara felt a wave of relief wash over her somehow. They had made it through the night. But the day ahead was uncertain, and Clara knew they couldn't stay here much longer. Clara slowly rose to her feet, stretching out her sore muscles. The events of the past day played through her mind, and she knew they had to find a more permanent solution. The city was still a dangerous place, and the war showed no signs of ending. But Clara was determined. She couldn't abandon the creature or the wolf, not after everything they had been through together. They had survived the collapse of the hospital, evaded the dangers of the city, and found shelter when all hope seemed lost. Now it was time to think about what came next. As Clara packed up the few supplies they had, she made a silent vow to protect the small creature and the wolf for as long as she could. They were a team now, bound together by the trials they had faced. Clara knew she couldn't do it alone, but she also knew that there were others out there, people who, like her, were trying to survive and help those who couldn't help themselves. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a place where they could rebuild, where they could be safe from the war that had torn their world apart. With the creature securely bundled in her arms and the wolf at her side, Clara stepped out of the shelter and into the early morning light. The city around them was still scarred by the war, but in the distance, she could hear the faint sounds of life voices, the clatter of movement, the hum of resilience. Clara took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past lift slightly from her shoulders. The journey ahead would be difficult, but she was ready to face it. Together, they would find their way through the ruins and toward whatever future awaited them. And in that moment, Clara knew that as long as they had each other, there was always hope.